There's a specific feeling that is different from surprise. It arrives when something you expected to fail, fails. And the feeling isn't shock. It isn't anger in the immediate sense. It isn't even disappointment in the way people usually mean that word. It is the quiet internal registration of a prediction confirmed. The moment where the part of you that had already run the numbers in some private backroom of your cognition receives the notification. Yes, that is what happened. You were right to expect this. The feeling doesn't shout. It just updates. If you're somewhere in the Gen Z window, you probably recognize that feeling more fluently than any previous generation at your age in living memory. Not because you are more cynical or more nihilistic or more disengaged from the world than the generations before you. Because you have had more opportunities to feel it. More predictions confirmed. More high-stakes institutional performances watched in real time. With full information at high resolution from positions close enough to observe the machinery operating that arrived at exactly the outcome the pattern suggested they would. Here's what nobody calls it precisely enough. This isn't distrust. Distrust implies that trust was the default and something broke it. A betrayal, a sudden rupture, a failure that arrived as a surprise. What researchers studying Gen Z civic attitudes are documenting is something with a different structure. It isn't the collapse of prior trust. It is the absence of a foundation for trust that was never built, because the formative years during which that foundation is typically constructed were spent watching institutions perform under precisely the conditions that reveal what they actually are. According to the Harvard Kennedy School Institute of Politics Annual Youth Survey, which has tracked political engagement and institutional attitudes among young Americans for more than 2 decades, trust in federal government among adults under 30 has been declining for more than a decade, reaching historic lows in the most recent measurement cycles. The Edelman Trust Barometer, which surveys institutional trust across dozens of countries annually, has documented similar patterns globally. Among the youngest adult cohort surveyed, government ranks consistently as the least trusted institution, below business, NGOs, and media. What the data describes isn't a generation that turned on institutions. It describes a generation that observed institutions over an extended and formative period, under conditions that provided unusual clarity and formed conclusions consistent with what they saw. The timeline of what they saw matters more than most analyses of this pattern stop to acknowledge. Picture this. It is 2008. You're 10 years old. The adults around you, your parents, teachers, the voices on every screen in every room, are describing something called a financial crisis with a specific quality of alarm that children are very good at detecting and not yet equipped to interpret. Houses in your neighborhood are going empty. Someone's parents lost a job. Someone else's family moved in with grandparents. The word bailout enters your vocabulary before you understand what a bank is. You don't have the language for credit default swaps or mortgage-backed securities, for the regulatory gaps that made the collapse possible, or for the political calculus that determined who absorbed the losses when it arrived. What you have is the experience of watching people who were supposed to understand how the system worked, regulators, legislators, the institutions whose stated purpose was to prevent exactly this outcome, fail to prevent it, and then explain, in the weeks and months that followed, why the people most responsible for the conditions that caused it would not bear primary responsibility for the consequences. You are 10. The lesson isn't delivered in a classroom. It arrives as ambient information, absorbed at exactly the age when children are building their foundational model of how the adult world actually operates. The oldest Gen Z members were 12 in 2008. The youngest were being born. By the time they reached political consciousness, the failure of institutional financial oversight wasn't history in any distant sense. It was recent memory, embedded in family finances, in neighborhood economies, in the specific household conditions they grew up inside. What the research on political socialization has established across decades is that foundational attitudes toward institutions are formed primarily during adolescence and early adulthood, and that these early formations are unusually stable, resistant to revision, and predictive of civic orientation for decades. A generation whose first clear exposure to institutions operating under high-stakes pressure was the 2008 response did not develop distrust as a reaction to later disappointments. They developed a framework, and later events were processed through it. The economic architecture Gen Z inherited from that moment forward was built on the conclusions that moment produced. Student loan debt had been positioned across 2 presidential administrations as the required investment for economic participation, normalized as the mechanism of upward mobility for a generation watching its parents lose housing equity during the years they were supposed to be building it. Federal Reserve data tracks outstanding student loan balances in the United States as a distinct economic category because the aggregate grew too significant to ignore, surpassing $1.5 trillion and concentrated among exactly the cohort simultaneously facing housing costs at ratios not seen in more than a generation. The institutions that presided over both conditions were the same institutions. The framework updated accordingly. What came next confirmed the framework more than it revised it. The housing data is where the abstract becomes structurally impossible to argue with. Analysis from research organizations, including the Harvard Joint Center for Housing Studies, has documented that the ratio of median home prices to median income for young adults has reached levels that are, in most major metropolitan areas, categorically different from anything the generations immediately preceding faced at comparable life stages. A median home in the United States now costs more than 6 times median household income, a ratio that in major urban markets runs considerably higher. For Gen Z adults carrying the student loan balances normalized as the price of professional entry during the same period, the math compresses further. What this describes is not a policy challenge in the ordinary sense. It is the accumulated output of decades of zoning restrictions, the financialization of residential property as an investment asset class, and political environments that consistently prioritize the interests of existing property holders over those of prospective buyers, producing a structural wall between where Gen Z stands and the economic pathway that previous generations received as a baseline expectation. The specific experience of running that math year after year in the context of institutions that set the relevant policy conditions and produce this outcome is not abstract. It is monthly rent. It is a spreadsheet that doesn't balance regardless of how many variables you try to optimize. And underneath the economic calculation runs a second kind of accounting, one that operates on a longer time scale and produces a different variety of the same underlying recognition. The American Psychological Association's research on climate anxiety has found that Gen Z reports higher rates of eco-distress than any other living generation, including adults who have watched considerably more years of environmental change unfold. What the APA Stress in America data shows is that climate change ranks among the leading stressors for Gen Z at levels exceeding every other cohort currently measured. What makes this specific burden distinct from ordinary concern is what psychologists call anticipatory grief, the experience of mourning futures that haven't yet been lost, but are understood as structurally compromised in ways that color every decision about how much to invest in them. Gen Z came of age during the window when IPCC reports moved from projection language into documentation of changes already measurable in the present. The institution's position to respond, legislative bodies, international frameworks, regulatory agencies, produced a visible and documentable output over more than a decade. What this generation absorbed wasn't pessimism. It was arithmetic applied to a specific set of inputs that the institutions themselves provided. Then COVID arrived, and the process that had been running at low resolution was broadcast at maximum clarity. What the pandemic did to Gen Z's relationship with institutional credibility is specific in a way that often gets collapsed into the broader conversation about pandemic politics. For a generation that had been forming its assessment of institutions through sustained observation, the pandemic provided something unprecedented, a real-time, high-stakes, globally visible test of institutional performance under conditions where the feedback loop between decision and consequence was compressed to weeks rather than years. Vaccine rollout logistics, supply chain failures, school closure decisions, public health communication. The machinery of institutional response was visible at a resolution that no previous generation had access to during a comparable event, with the simultaneous ability to compare performance across jurisdictions in real time. What Gen Z observed was not simply institutions failing in the abstract. It was institutions performing, some competently, some not, some demonstrably shaped by interests that were not the stated public interest, in conditions where the performance could be tracked, benchmarked, and evaluated against stated commitments with a specificity that previous information environments didn't allow. The update to the framework was not a collapse of remaining trust. It was a refinement, more data processed through the same analytical lens, arriving at conclusions consistent with the existing pattern. Here is what I want to say directly to you. If the institutional exhaustion you carry feels less like cynicism and more like the quiet tiredness of someone who has been paying attention for a long time, the specific flatness that arrives when you hear a policy announcement or a campaign promise or a government statement about what will finally be addressed in the next term, that distinction is meaningful. What the research on political disengagement in Gen Z consistently shows is that the withdrawal from conventional political participation is not, in most cases, apathy. It is the logical output of a cost-benefit calculation performed by people who evaluated the available evidence and reached a conclusion about the return on investment of certain kinds of engagement. The researchers at institutions, including Harvard Kennedy School, who study this pattern, distinguish carefully between disengagement driven by hopelessness and disengagement driven by a specific, revisable assessment of where effort produces return. That distinction matters because the intervention is different. You don't address a rational calculation with an inspiration campaign. You address it with evidence. What the political science research on civic renewal consistently identifies as the mechanism that shifts the calculation is not better messaging or more accessible voting infrastructure, though neither of those things are irrelevant. It is demonstrated returns, visible, concrete, traceable instances where the mechanism of engagement produced an outcome different from the baseline, distributed in ways that match the stated intent, attributable to specific action, observable to the people who took it. Not promises, evidence. The distinction between those two things is not idealism versus cynicism. It is the difference between an argument and a data point. And a generation trained from early adolescence on pattern recognition, with full information in real time, with a decade of data points to draw on, is not going to revise its framework on the basis of an argument when the data is pointing in the same direction. The governments that are running out of moves are running out because the moves they have remaining are the ones that produce the pattern this generation already recognizes. Understanding why that recognition exists, not as nihilism, not as a failure to care, but as the accumulated conclusion of sustained and unusually clear observation, is the only place from which something structurally different becomes possible to imagine, let alone to build. If this names something you've been carrying without a clean frame for it, if the flatness you feel toward institutions finally has a mechanism rather than just a mood, say in the comments. Not for me, but because naming the pattern accurately is usually what makes it possible to locate where, inside it, something still moves. And if you know someone who describes themselves as just not caring about politics when what they're actually running is this calculation, send this without commentary. Sometimes the right frame is the only thing that changes what feels possible. Like this if it reached somewhere real. I'll see you in the next one.